All set to go?
Yep.
Okay. Well, good morning. And sooner or later, the weather is going to turn cold. So let's think about how to keep warm when we're cold. In the winter time, when the wind blows on the window panes. That's an old song that the Slovak people used to sing. Well, anyway, I got lots of different stories about how to keep warm. I'll start with a very interesting story about kids walking to school. My mother told me this story. They had a long walk to school, and so her mother and lots of other mothers would put a potato in the oven on the old kitchen range and bake a potato. And the kids would carry the potato in their mittens. Now, the mittens were wool, but wool doesn't keep the wind out. So it felt pretty good to have that hot potato in your hand all the way. Then they'd get to school, and maybe there was a furnace downstairs, and there would, where air would come up, and the teacher would put the potatoes on that, or, as close to whatever heat they had, and then at noon, they'd have other things to eat, but they'd always have a hot potato. Now that, I think, was very, very clever. But that's just about keeping your hands warm. Now the feet were another thing too. Remember those old 4-buckle overshoes? Oh, they felt good. And of course you'd wear wool in the winter. No. Don't mess around with cotton. It isn't as warm. Although, remember the flannel sheets we used to have? None of these shiny sheets that they have now. They don't feel warm in the wintertime. But I grew up, the only kind of sheets we had were flannel sheets. They kind of keep you toasty. And sometimes you put a bed warmer in by your feet, especially a hot water bottle or something like that. So there were lots of ways to keep warm, but a lot of those old houses that they had to build when they came here, the Scandinavians who came made log houses. Well, log houses are not warm. You got to find some way to keep them warm. So you'd pile stuff up on the outside, and then you wanted a windbreak. Now, it's not hard to find this kind of thing out in the country where you're up in the high ground, I can think of a whole lot of places just straight north on Highway 52 or up the old middle Hesper Road, You plant trees on the north and the west side as a windbreak. It helps. And then if the snow gets deep, fine, the snow can insulate too. There were lots of ways to keep a house or a cabin a little bit warmer at least. But if you lived in the farm, now it wasn't so bad in the country because the wind wasn't so strong in the country here, in town. But if you were out in the country, you had to do a lot of work outside. And there was nothing better for your hands than a sheepskin mitten with the wool on the inside. Aha! That was the warmest kind of mitten you could have. And I remember, because I grew up on farms, you had to haul manure out in the wintertime. And when you were out there with a team of horses pulling the sleigh to spread that cow manure around out there, sometimes it would freeze before it hit the ground. It sure felt good to have big boots on or a pair of sheepskin mitts with the wool on the inside. That really helped. And let's see, there are some other things we got to think about when it's how to keep warm in the wintertime. Now, if you're up in the highlands, you need all the insulation you can get. And when hay bales and straw bales were invented, oh boy, you could stack the bales too high around the house, especially on the north and the west side, because usually that's where the wind came from, was on the north and the west side. So bales were a real help. Whether it was straw or hay, it didn't matter a whole lot. But once you got out there in the field, oh my, how the wind would blow, and mittens would feel very, very good. And the walls, insulation like we have nowadays, those cabins didn't have it. But you'd hang blankets, and if you were lucky, if you could get one of those army blankets that they used in World War I and the ones that they still use in World War II, oh boy, they were thick, heavy wool. You would hang them up along the wall, and it would keep the wall warmer. But remember the old patchwork quilts. Not the fancy quilts we make now, but patchwork quilts. There's an old saying, waste not, want not. And what would you do with the old clothes? Well, you'd cut them in pieces, and you'd make a patchwork quilt, and you'd stuff it. I don't know what they'd put inside. Layers of cotton or something like that. And I remember a patchwork quilt made by my grandma, and it was fairly thick, and then they would sew it together, sewed by hand, because they didn't have sewing machines then. And I could look at that patchwork quilt, and I could see pieces of the clothes that were worn by my grandpa and my uncle and my great uncle. There they were, old neckties, old shirts, pieces of old overalls. It made a very interesting quilt. Not fancy, but interesting. And I had one of those quilts till I gave it away to my oldest son about, oh my goodness, it must have been about 30 years ago. And I said, now this quilt has a lot of history in it. You won't know the history, but I could tell you where that patch came from. It was the old men, mostly. And the women, too. If the apron wore out, you'd take a piece of the apron and you'd make that patchwork quilt out of it. So there were all sorts of ways to use leftovers to make things warm. But if you had to go outside to an old outhouse for one reason or another, and there were only two, oh boy, you didn't want to do that in the middle of the night. So I remember doing this. My bedroom happened to be on the east side, which should have been the warmest, but the floor was so darn cold there because there was no basement under the floor there, and it just seemed the cold ground came right up through the door, right up through the floor. It made me cold. And so what we'd do, we would take a bucket and fill it with snow. And if I had to pee in the middle of the night, I'd pee right into the snow and then dump it out in the morning. A real practical way to keep things as warm as possible. So you gotta think about how to do it. And those people who went out west and built those sod houses, believe it or not, a sod house was warmer than a log house. Those log houses that you see around here, that they have out behind the Vesterheim Museum, they weren't warm at all. So you had to hang blankets, you had to hang anything you could find on the inside of the wall to kind of keep it warm. But if you got out on the prairie, you would dig down in that prairie sod, and you would take big chunks of prairie sod and stack them up like bricks And by the time you had done that, you had a floor in the house that was maybe a foot or even 2 feet lower than the sod outside. You had a sod house. And then you try to get some lumber somewhere. It was hard to get lumber out there in South Dakota and North Dakota. They didn't have many trees. You'd lay that across the top, and then you'd lay sod on top of that. Now, when the snow fell and it drifted, it would drift so high that it would help to keep the old sod house warm. How do you like that? Yeah, snow is an insulation. Now, I could tell you something you wouldn't know about, but on January term, I used to take students up north, Boundary Waters, and we teach them how to make a really good snow house. Not the kind the Eskimos make. What we do, we take a shovel out there, and this was right on top of the ice, and you throw snow until you had a great big pile of snow. Then you'd carve it out from the inside, and you'd leave it as thick as possible because that snow would keep the wind from coming in. Now, we had strong sleeping bags. That helped a lot. But, you know, you can even use the snow to help keep you warm in the wintertime. Nowadays, of course, we have all this fancy equipment. All I have to do to warm the house up is go to the control that I have in the living room and dial the temperature I want, and the furnace automatically goes on downstairs and it gets warm. Huh. Well, another trick I learned up there in the north. You know what gets cold first? Your fingers and your toes. What we call the extremities. Might include the ears and the nose too. But you can always put a heavy cap over. There are a lot of good caps. And remember earmuffs? Oh yeah, I remember having an earmuff when I'd walk to school, and it was usually about a mile or a mile and a half. Earmuffs really helped a lot. But, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, the other thing we learned. If you have extra vests, and we had a whole lot of old wool vests, if you get the middle of your body warm, guess what happens? The blood flows out to the fingers and the toes. So what you do to keep your fingers and your toes warm is put an extra vest on. Because when the middle of your body gets too warm, it sends the blood out there. All sorts of tricks for keeping warm. Well, nowadays we don't have to worry about it so much. Though I have a friend who's only just turned 50 years old. She was my student once. And she said, even if she lives in a city, she said, when winter comes, I change the sheets and put flannel sheets on, because flannel sheets are so much warmer. They're just a little bit fluffy, you know. And then there's underwear. I learned something from both of my grandpas, that they wore long underwear, of course, in the wintertime, and the underwear were woolen. Now, a lot of people can't stand wool next to their skin, but I guess if you're born Scandinavian, you don't mind, because they'd have. But one of the things I learned was that they had 2 sets of underwear, both woolen. One for the summer, which had short sleeves, and one for the winter, which had long sleeves. Now, wool sweats. The moisture goes through. Cotton absorbs, the moisture stays in. So you want to wear wool underwear. But in the summertime, you want to roll up your sleeves so you have short-sleeved woolen underwear. Only the old-timers did that. But some of those old Scandinavians who came over, they were used to that from where they came from. So they knew how to keep warm. And I guess I kind of appreciate the way we keep warm these days, but if you're going to go outside, you better have the warmest kind of mittens you can have. And the warmest kind of boots. And I find that if you have good stockings underneath, nothing is warmer than those old four-buckle farm boots. Yep. The thicker you make, the thicker the layers between you and the cold, the warmer you can feel. So, if you don't have to worry about being warm now because of the modern contrivances that we have, it's fun to think about the ways that people used to keep warm. And the kinds of blankets and such they had to hang on the inside of the walls of those old log houses that they built when they came to this part of Iowa. Yep, you had to have a lot of extra stuff to hang up. That's the kind of insulation you had. Anyway, good luck keeping warm, or have fun thinking about the way we used to do it.